I know this does not shock anybody that knows Bernie. He is still watching people walk out of their offices to go on their smoke break. Now he is videotaping people out there and going on their smoke break.
In late 2001, as the company he created was crashing down around him, Bernie Ebbers worried about smoking breaks. President of Customer Service Diana Day laid down some new rules she said Ebbers was demanding. This conference call between Day and her senior managers was obtained by CNBC.
Well, this is the whole list of things right here that at the end of the meeting Bernie has for all of us to sum it all up, go back to the old way, the old, quote, LDES way of doing business. He wants us to go back to black and white presentations. We all can afford a dime or a quarter for a cup of coffee. Also, no more paying for bottled water and no coffee pods at desks. When you walk out of your office, turn off your lights. He said, either you execute or he's going to get involved. So, you know what that means. Just go ahead and do it, or your life will be absolutely miserable.
While his company was committing the biggest accounting fraud in corporate history, Bernie Ebbers was ready to make life miserable for any employee who didn't turn off the lights. That fraud started in earnest after WorldCom's deal to acquire Sprint was turned away by federal regulators in the summer of 2000.
With the Sprint deal being killed, it put us in a situation, who were you going to buy of any size? So now you had to turn into an operations company. And the question was posed, I think, on the street as well as internally is, you know, how well would Bernie do as an operating CEO versus an acquisition and growth CEO?
With his latest deal in shambles, Ebbers faced an additional challenge in the summer of 2000, the most difficult operating environment of his career.
The economy was in trouble, the telecom sector was in trouble, and WorldCom being part of that was in trouble.
Certain businesses started to not be able to make their revenue targets. So there was a lot more of customers that we were running across that had not paid their commitments to us.
Of all those customers, the internet companies were in the worst shape.
In 2001, we processed over 100 bankruptcies out of that segment alone, companies that just literally went out of business as customers of WorldCom, and in some cases left us with substantial billings.
The revenues weren't there. I was in the world where I knew if orders went in or not. And the orders just weren't there. And so there are a lot of people in customer service wondering what's going to happen.
The answer? The biggest accounting fraud in the history of corporate America.
They began to draw down on reserves, inflate their income when the reserves, as they must be, were ultimately exhausted. Then they undertook even more brazen efforts at restating expenses as capital expenditures, which had the effect of raising the income.
WorldCom would make good on its earnings numbers for Wall Street by making those numbers up.
If the actual numbers were used and not the cooked numbers, it would show that they missed those earning targets in 11 out of the 13 quarters between 1998 and 2002. And in the last 4 of the last 5 quarters prior to the actual bankruptcy, they actually lost money.
Senior managers at the company knew the true state of the business. What they couldn't figure out was how the numbers given investors were staying strong.
The charges filed today are a result of an extensive investigation of WorldCom Incorporated.
In August of 2002, the Justice Department indicted several top WorldCom executives. The charges followed the company's own admission that its profits for the previous 3 years were an illusion. Massive accounting fraud had made a business gone bad look good. The phony income would soon grow to more than $11 billion. The largest fraud ever committed by a U.S. corporation.
We were astounded on the one hand. On the other hand, the light bulb went off. That's the answer that we didn't understand, and that was the reason that we couldn't understand.
It was not only, oh my gosh, but wow, what a relief.
What about anger?
I can understand relief, and I can understand those emotions, but I have to believe that a part of you thinks about the thousands of employees who lost their jobs, the people you perhaps had to fire because you thought they weren't up to the task.
Think of all the companies that went out of business that assumed that that was real.
At WorldCom, few things were real. It was a company whose business model was built on a lie. Frustration over that state of affairs boiled over during strategy meetings at AT&T.
We would look at each other. I turned to the Senior Vice President and President of Network Operations, Frank Ianna, and say, Frank, how can they do this?
Count us into that group. We couldn't figure out how they were pricing as aggressively as they were. How can they be so efficient in their costs and their expenses?
We just couldn't figure it out. And particularly on some of the long-term government contracts that we lost, we also thought they must be doing just a terrific job of taking their cost structure down. And that then accelerated onto us to take our cost structure down even faster.
Sprint is cutting 6,000 employees and an additional 1,500 contract workers. The cuts represent about 7% of Sprint's workforce.
If you figure that each person probably has, a spouse and a child, say it's 2.5, that's 17,000 people in our company whose lives were affected in a very negative way.
Well, you laid them off.
We laid them off, and that's just in our
you were
company
trying
to get our costs in line with what their costs appeared to be.
The market said, what a marvelous management job WorldCom's doing, and they look over at AT&T and they'd say, these guys aren't keeping up. So my shareholders were hurt. We laid off tens of thousands of employees in an accelerated fashion. And I think the industry was hurt.
And just wrecked the whole industry.
I cried. I really did.
Why?
Because I'd been there 19 years. Because I knew what we had built.
It's beyond me how somebody could behave that way. I don't know how you get up and, if you're a man, and shave every morning and look at yourself in the mirror, how you could live a life knowing the type of things that you're doing, knowing that it's wrong